All right, boys, welcome back to Star Spangled Gamblers. This is your OG podcast about betting and winning real money on politics. And I guess we're headed from east to west like our ancestors, the pioneers, did. Today, we are making stops in Texas along the Rio Grande and kind of just throughout the insanity of the American electorate. Super excited to have in the lab with us today, Scott Braddock. Scott is the editor of Quorum Report, and he is the host of the Texas Take podcast over at the Houston Chronicle. Translating into layman's terms, Scott, tell me if I'm just absolutely butchering your essence. I just feel like you're the guy in the Texas State House who knows where everybody is buried. And like, that's always the guy we want on a show about political gambling. So do you in fact know where the bodies are buried?
Well, I'm not going to admit that on your show. That would probably not help me, right, in doing my job. But I would say this: it's pretty much right. This is the way I talk about the Quorum Report to people who I call civilians. You know, in politics, I view folks as either civilians or combatants. The combatants would be lawmakers, people who are, their staffers, lobbyists, political consultants, et cetera. For the Quorum Report, it's sort of like, if you're walking through the halls of the Capitol and you might see one lobbyist whisper to another one, "Hey, did you hear this or did you hear that?" The other person will say, "Yes, I'm a subscriber to the Quorum Report also."
I love that. I love that. So for all of us who follow like federal politics, you're like the punch bowl Jake Sherman for what exactly is going on in Austin that only psychopaths, awesome.
Yeah, but just the minute to minute stuff, and really the sort of the intelligence for political professionals to be serious about it, so that they can make decisions, based on real intelligence, real time information. They can make their decisions about what they're going to do when it comes to campaigns, when it comes to their lobbying, et cetera.
So ostensibly, we're here to talk about a couple primaries, Jessica Cisneros, Henry Cuellar, George P. versus Ken Paxton. But I feel like we'd be doing a grave disservice to our audience, not just to talk about Texas for a second. Like, what a wild ride that I just feel like Texas politics is so huge now in the country. And it's absolutely crazy. I mean, it's like no holds barred, right? Unlimited money from any person to any person. Mm-hmm. I mean, like it's just right. Different, right?
It's very different, I think it's fair to characterize Texas politics as and it's the only former nation state, right, in the country, that we were a country first, and now we're a state. And covering politics in Texas, I got to tell you, I put a lot of miles on my truck during campaigns to try to go and figure out what's happening. This is a state that is 254 counties spread across 2 time zones, and about 30 million people live here. And if you think about just the geographic diversity that offers, I mean, it is further from Beaumont, Texas to El Paso, Texas than it is from El Paso to the Pacific Ocean. When I was working at CBS News in Dallas on the desk there, sometimes CBS would call from New York at headquarters, wondering about something that had happened out in far west Texas. Maybe there had been a shooting or a fire in El Paso, and they were asking us in Dallas if we were sending a reporter to El Paso County. And I would tell them, what you should do is call our station in Los Angeles, because they're actually closer. If you think about the diversity of the state, we have, the most diverse city in the United States in Houston. We have the most diverse ethnically county in the United States, which is actually a suburban county of Houston.
Which one's
Fort Bend County. That's Fort Bend County, where Sugar Land, Texas is.
Oh, yeah.
And we have just this explosive growth. We have 1,000 people moving to the state every day. And that was true even during the height of pandemic restrictions in 2020. We still had about 1,100, 1,200 people moving to Texas every day. And so the rapid changes in our politics are because of that. The way that our congressional and legislative districts were redrawn last year is because of that. And we may get a second bite at the apple, because the Texas Constitution says that the lawmakers have to redraw the maps, in the first regular session of the legislature after the census, which would actually be the 2023 census. And as looking at it, I just saw this morning, there's an estimate from the Census Bureau that they miscounted Texas, probably undercounted us by at least about 500,000 people. So we do have somewhere between 29 to 31 million people living in Texas. Some of those folks, of course, are not documented. There was a big push by President Trump and his allies to not count people in the United States who are, here unauthorized to work in the U.S. But of course, that doesn't serve the people of Texas very well. But with so many people moving here, think about it this way: we set records every single day, right? We set record today. There will be a
Right.
record number of toilets flushed in Texas because so many people just moved here. There'll be a record number of people turning on the lights and air conditioners because so many people move here. There'll be a record number, of kids in Texas schools come the fall because people continue to move here. And you can't have that kind of explosive growth in a state without having, incredible needs for water, for electricity, for public education and other infrastructure, transportation as well. And all that has to be addressed by the state government in conjunction with the feds. But you also have just a very quickly changing politics here, right? I mean, go back to 2014 when the Republican governor beat the Democratic challenger. Greg Abbott beat Wendy Davis by 21
Oh
points.
man, what a bygone era that was.
Yeah, and that is nothing like what happened 4 years later in 2018 when Beto O'Rourke, came within 2 or 3 points of beating Ted Cruz, and things kind of stayed, just stayed the course in 2020. And that, of course, was with a lot of Republican investment of millions and millions of dollars spent in 2018 and 2020 by the GOP to keep what they have in Texas. And if you look at the redistricting maps that they drew, it's the first time that Republicans didn't really try to expand the number of Republican seats. They didn't move that number very much, but it's because they were busy, and the critics call it gerrymandering. Others say it's just it's smart politics on their part to really shape districts in such a way that they'll continue to elect Republicans, even if that means, and it does mean in this case, breaking up communities of color. It was quite a sight to see, and we saw all that happen within a 30-day special session last year, which is never, I don't think it's ever happened exactly that way, but that's because the census was delayed and they didn't have the numbers until later in the year.
Well, I mean, there's nothing that belongs more so in a modern art gallery than a Texas congressional district. I mean, truly the way these things are drawn
Right.
are fixtures of art. So let's talk about one of them. So I think you've
Mhm.
sort of foreshadowed this well because, I'm from California. They used to say, as California goes, so goes the nation. Maybe
Mhm.
that's a story that's more told about Texas and Florida these days. And we'll
Mhm.
get some of those trends, I think, in this. So I think I'm gonna start us off with Texas's 28th congressional district, which is a very
Okay.
spicy primary. Can I tease it a little bit? Are you ready to go
Sure.
there?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, all right, all right. So here's how I understand it. So on May 24th, so the votes are already being counted. Early votes are.
Yes.
This district, which is just a weird little zigzag kind of Statue of Liberty torch that goes from San Antonio down to the Rio Grande.
Mhm.
This primary election day is May 24th, and it's sort of this like mashup of these trends we hear about suburbanites in San Antonio versus those like mysterious Trump voting Latinos down in the Rio
Mhm.
Grande. And then we're also
Right.
seeing we've got two candidates. We've got kind of AOC Bernie backed Jessica Cisneros, and we've got one of the last blue dogs in Henry Cuellar. And the eyes of us, at least degens, are very much upon this race. And once again, this is why I'm thankful to have you here. So did I get that right, or are there more storylines buried in this race?
I think there are a lot of storylines in it, but you teed it up very well. I tend to think about South Texas politics as just a moving target at this point and rapidly changing. In a lot of ways, it's like other regions of the state. Earlier I was saying that this is still sort of like covering an entire country's politics, because if you go from East Texas to South Texas, they're in a lot of ways nothing alike, but in some ways there are things that bind us all together. And in East Texas, I mean, you think about the kind of folks who used to be elected there, the blue dogs like Charlie Wilson. Of course, the movie
Yeah.
about Charlie Wilson's were one of the last, prominent Democrats from Deep East Texas. Those were fairly conservative Democrats. And what happened in East Texas for you, and it's all the way until about 2002 that you had Democratic lawmakers being elected in some of those rural parts of the state, and that came to a close in 2002. 2003 is
Yeah.
when Tom DeLay he pushed for the mid-decade redistricting of Texas, which was very controversial at the time. You might remember that's when Texas House Democrats fled to Oklahoma in a quorum break, and
Oh
similar to
yeah,
a quorum
yeah.
break.
I remember when Chet Edwards lost. I mean, that was like the
Right.
funeral for the Texas Democrat.
Right, and that was a little bit later, right?
Yeah.
They had to redistrict. They had to gun for Chet Edwards for quite some time. He was based in Waco, which is technically more rural than places like Houston and Dallas. But it's interesting that his district went from Waco on up to parts of Dallas County, which are much more Democratic. So he was able to pick up votes there. But those places like Deep East Texas were very conservative, but still electing Democrats. And that's sort of a cultural thing. And you don't stop electing Democrats just organically. Republicans have to go make investments to convince you that you're not right for voting for Democrats. Right. And look, that's what's happening in South Texas. You have some pretty conservative folks who live. And by the way, when people talk about South Texas, generally they usually mean the Valley, which is really just 4 counties in South Texas along the Rio Grande.
That means something else where I'm from.
Right. So to me, malls. Yeah. You're right. To me, South Texas means right in the valley there. But South Texas to me generally means any place sort of south, either along or south of the Interstate 10 corridor. From San Antonio south is South Texas to me. And so that takes in a much larger area, and that takes in the district that you're talking about. But in the valley and in places like Webb County, where Laredo is along the Rio Grande, you have a lot of these conservative Democrats who haven't been convinced yet to elect Republicans. They've been convinced to move in that direction, right? You had President Trump make gains in South Texas, particularly in the Valley, and in some other parts of South Texas as well. Really, the people who are voting for Trump, I think people think about the demographics on this maybe in the wrong way. People are thinking more about Hispanics, and what I would tell folks is that what Republicans are really doing down there is they're having success with rural voters, right? Whether they're white, brown, or whatever, right. People who would be very pro Second Amendment, people who would say that they are pro-life and anti-abortion, people who oppose things like the quote unquote Green New Deal. I know there's argument about whether that's even really a thing, kind of just a slogan from AOC, but you do have a lot of Democrats who, guess what, work in the oil and gas industry in South Texas. So they are more aligned with somebody like Henry Cuellar, who has been more aligned with the oil and gas industry, as opposed to somebody who does, have AOC campaigning for her. That'd be Jessica Cisneros. You had AOC campaigning for her in Bexar County. That district, it takes in that conservative area along the Rio Grande, where you have more of those conservative Democrats. It takes in parts of Bexar County, in San Antonio, in the city itself, just east of the Alamo Plaza. And a lot of people there in Bexar County have never voted for Congressman Cuellar. So that's really a battleground in this election. He's trying to make his case to people all throughout the district, not just in his home base of Laredo in that area, but also up in the northern end of the district. And I'm going to watch this, this very closely as far as and we don't have numbers out of there just yet, to complete numbers, but watch the early voting turnout. As you mentioned, they're starting to count ballots, starting to cast votes. They'll count ballots later in the district. They'll count ballots on Tuesday. Fact is that if you have Bexar County really coming out strong, I think that would be bad news for Congressman Cuellar, because that's really where the base of support is for the more progressive darling, Jessica Cisneros. But if Webb County is turning out big, if Laredo and that area and the rural counties along the I-35 corridor, if they're really coming out in a big way, then I would think that is better for Congressman Cuellar. One other thing I would say about it, and this part is fascinating to me, I don't think that Representative Cuellar would even be in a runoff if we didn't have one key thing that had happened as a result of redistricting last year and the fact that Republicans want to make inroads in South Texas. We have a party switcher in the Texas House of Representatives. In the state legislature, a guy named Ryan Guillen, who was a longtime Democratic lawmaker, switched to the Republican Party, and he's running as a Republican for the Texas House to come back to the state legislature. And his district in the state legislature overlaps with this district we're talking about, with the Cuellar and Cisneros district. And what happened in March, when the first round of voting happened in the primaries, part of the strategy by the Ryan Guillen campaign, they ran a pretty sophisticated campaign. He won the primary. And part of that was convincing conservative Democrats who have always voted in the Democratic primary to switch along with him over to the Republican primary. So you're talking about thousands of voters who would have been the kind of folks who are more sympathetic or supportive of Congressman Cuellar, who were not voting in the Democratic primary. They were voting in the Republican primary for Ryan Guillen.
Oh, I see.
So he's taking votes away from Congressman Cuellar. That's another thing to keep in mind, is those conservative Democrats who are now voting in the Republican primary, by state law, they're not allowed to vote in the runoff in the Democratic primary because they chose the GOP in March. So that's something that puts.
So
Cuellar,
they're basically permanently removed from the reservoir of potential votes for Cuellar.
Absolutely. In Texas, we don't register by Republican or Democrat. The way you let people know which one you are is you pick which, it's an open primary. You let people go ahead and vote in the Republican or Democratic primary. But if you do choose one of those, when it's time for the runoff, you have to stick with the party you chose in March. And so, yes, those voters are blocked out of voting for Cuellar. One other thing is that we have heard over the last week or so that there are some quote unquote dark money groups that are coming in with some last minute support for Congressman Cuellar to try to get him over the finish line, lobbing nasty attacks at Jessica Cisneros. They're talking about her being a home wrecker and a few other things. And so you have nasty attacks. It's that time in Texas politics. It's the Wednesday and Thursday before a May runoff, and at the quorum report, this is about the time that we start getting unmarked Manila envelopes left on the front door, with all kinds of information that's interesting about candidates that maybe people don't want to have their names attached to that information. So they'll throw anything they can at the wall, see what sticks. And I think the other big narrative out of this, the other big story, is that district, as it's constructed now, is potentially a pickup for Republicans in the fall.
Right.
And Republicans, the minority leader McCarthy in Washington has made no secret of it, that they do that. Look,
they probably want to run against Cisneros.
That's right. So they think that, look, if Cisneros is nominated, that's a much more conservative district overall, and the Republicans have a better shot at picking it up. And of course, that's why Speaker Pelosi is defending Cuellar, because that's one of her members, right? That's just speaker politics. He's a vote for the speaker, and on a vast majority of issues, he's with the Democrats, but not everything, right? He's certainly more conservative than her caucus. And you heard Speaker Pelosi just the other day say, look, it doesn't matter that his home was raided, his office was raided by the FBI. She said that the FBI has said that he's not under any investigation. We'll see what happens with all that, by the way. That's watch this space kind of thing as far as whether anybody's going to be indicted in connection with what's gone on with that law enforcement action. And then the speaker also said, look, he's not pro choice, but it doesn't matter. We have enough Democrats in the House to pass legislation on that.
They're not short of votes on that.
They'd rather be she's making the case, they'd rather be a big tent than kick the person out because they don't agree on everything. The majority whip, Jim Clyburn, he was at some events in Texas just in recent weeks to try to fire people up for Congressman Cuellar. And, you do see this infighting in the Democratic Party, where when Clyburn was going to hold an event in Austin after he had just held an event in San Antonio supporting Cuellar, I was hearing about some pro-choice Democrats who were just canceling their RSVP for the event in Austin because they didn't want anything to do with Clyburn after he had been stumping for a guy who's not with them on the abortion issue. Yeah, it's just nasty infighting going on.
Let me ask you a more general question. I feel like this is going to be a really successful interview if I just ask you super basic questions and then you just hit me back with that type of fire there. So getting to the core of who actually wants to vote for these people. So I know Henry Cuellar from when I was a staffer. And to me, he's sort of like the Kyle Shanahan, Lane Kiffin type candidate. He wins. He's just good enough to keep his job. Whereas Cisneros comes off to me as a little bit of a Kamala Harris type candidate who's sort of like a lot of national Democrats would like to cast her in the role. They'd like to give her money, but I'm not really persuaded that they're dying to vote for her, which to me is well, what exactly is the base of support for these two candidates? I mean, is there a conventional ground game campaign sense? Is there a candidate who's just outworking the other and just has it? Or is this, two kind of average Joes running an average race?
I think it's a good question. I think they're really both working it. And, I do think that you're right, that they're sort of typecast, as this kind of a lawmaker and this kind of a challenger. But Cisneros, give her due. She's somebody who this is now her second run against Cuellar. She barely lost to him the first time around. And progressives do believe that they can get somebody across the finish line in South Texas. So one of the things that is different about this is, as I mentioned, the district is configured differently from what it was before. That's almost, for the Republicans, it's kind of like baiting the Democrats into trying to nominate somebody who's more progressive so that the Republicans can try to make a run at that seat in the fall.
Do you know if they're actually spending money on that? Do you know if they're taking that step of actually putting super PAC money in on Cisneros' side?
For that the progressives are doing that?
No. Whether Republicans are putting super PAC money in there to help her. I mean, we see that from time to time now.
Yeah, I have not seen any evidence of that. That doesn't mean it isn't happening. And as
Yeah.
you know, a lot of times we don't even see that or have the ability to prove it until after the election is over. But I do think it's a possibility. I mean, and we just saw that in where was it in Pennsylvania, where the Democrats were trying to support a candidate who is a Republican who they think that they can beat in the fall, which is probably in that race I would say is probably playing with fire. But people in PA know more about that than I do. But look, I mean, I think that the Republicans are sort of salivating at the idea that in that particular district, that Cisneros would be the one to be the nominee come the fall, because look, they're trying to take the House. I think the wind is at their back right, nationally, because of the economy and a whole lot of other things. But to your question, as far as whether they're both running real races, I think it's probably about as hard as Cuellar has campaigned in a long time. He's taking it very seriously, and he's got serious serious baggage. That, as I said, FBI was at his office. You don't.
Was he the one who stole the election, or what was that all about?
We still don't know the full story on all of that. There have been various stories that were printed in national press that people can check out about some of the questions around some of Congressman Cuellar's activities in Washington. But the fact is, just for a campaign, it's just not a good look, right, to have any picture in the newspaper that shows the FBI windbreakers in the foreground. So he's campaigning as hard as he can. He's saying that he didn't do anything wrong, and he's saying it's all going to come out in the wash. And he did say in a statement earlier this year that whatever they're investigating, he claims that law enforcement will prove that he didn't engage in any wrongdoing. That doesn't mean that no one did, just that he didn't, right? And so I think the challenges for him right now are real, and I think there's kind of mixed feelings on the Republican side. I mean, I think that they would probably not mind having Henry Cuellar back because he does vote with them on a few things. And I think, privately, some Republicans have said, look, we like Congressman Cuellar, but if he's gone, that may very well be our seat to take.
Pratik, do you want to open up the lines here, or what do you think?
Yeah, well, so to give you a sense of where the markets are right now, for most of the election, the markets had it roughly at a 50-50. In the last couple of weeks, bettors are very much of the view that Cisneros is the favorite, roughly a 65-35 favorite if you look at predicted and Polymarket. And then on predicted, there's a market on what the margin will be between them. And generally right now, the markets are anticipating a very close race within 2 points. So I guess my question would be, number one, do you think the markets are roughly getting it right? And then number two, obviously, I think you've outlined the broad outlines that Cisneros is the progressive candidate, Cuellar is the more moderate, but who would you say are the swing voters who are in all likelihood going to tip the race one way or the other?
Let me go back to what was said about the FBI raid at the congressman's office. That's the kind of thing that, if you are undecided, might help make your decision for you, right? Maybe there's some cloud of scandal over this person. The other thing that I think the markets are probably getting right about this is Cisneros is definitely surging after we got the news, the leak of the Roe versus Wade decision, or the abortion decision that looks to be on track to come out from the Supreme Court later this year. That really fired up pro-choice activists, folks who are very upset about losing the right of a woman to choose to get an abortion if that's what she's seeking. And that has, just as I said, that's got some folks, canceling, their RSVPs for events, hardcore Democratic activists. And in a race like this, it's a low turnout affair, right? Really, I mean, this is a runoff in May. Who votes at the end of May in Texas? I mean, nobody really knows that, but I can tell you, in years of covering these races where you have an incumbent in Texas who's going to a runoff, it's exactly where you do not want to be. If you don't clear the 50% hurdle, that means that you have a record in office that at least more than half of the people who voted disagree with you and want you gone, right? And so we've seen that on the Republican side in 2012. That's how we got Senator Ted Cruz. He beat a statewide elected official, the lieutenant governor of Texas. He beat a well-established person in a runoff that was delayed because of redistricting. And then the lieutenant governor of Texas currently, Dan Patrick, who's a conservative firebrand, he won a runoff with the same guy, with David Dewhurst, who's now the former lieutenant governor. And in those runoffs, I think this is true for Republicans and Democrats, The fact is, the person who votes is the most motivated to vote. It's the kind of person who would crawl through, broken glass in the rain to be able to vote for their preferred candidate. And for more establishment candidates, that's just not the kind of supporter that they get. They have a much better chance of winning if they can win outright in March. And the other thing I would say is 11 weeks of a runoff. It's not just a lifetime in politics; it's a couple of lifetimes, right? I mean, since the March election, voters have been digesting that news about the FBI raid. Who knew that the leak was going to come out from the Supreme Court and fire up the folks who are, pro-choice and get them really out to vote? That's the kind of thing that may put Cisneros over the edge. I think the markets are right. She's definitely surging right now. Come Tuesday, we'll see what the votes are.
Well, I guess we should address Cisneros's baggage, which is she's in a sense like a candidate for the American dream, because she was like dating / banging / an item with the hot high school teacher, which almost all of us who were teenage boys probably thought about that at some point in our life. But, now she's an adult and that's sort of a bad look. But do you think anyone cares? Like, is that, does the homewrecker billboard, is that a thing, or is that just who cares?
I think it's the kind of thing that I think only hardens existing divisions. I don't think that anybody is swayed by that. I think that if somebody was in the camp for Cuellar and they see that, they already didn't like Cisneros and they just, dislike her even more. And if they support Cisneros, they already supported her. I think that kind of a thing just makes them want to defend their candidate. I'll give you an example, something that happened in a Republican primary years ago. I think this was in 2014. I'll double check it for you, but it was several cycles back, where we had a Tea Party firebrand from Tarrant County. And Tarrant County, you'll hear about a lot. It's the biggest urban county that is a Tea Party hotbed in the country. Probably that's where Fort Worth is. In the suburban areas around Fort Worth, the Tea Party has really taken hold. And there's a lawmaker who's now retired named Jonathan Stickland, who made national news for a few things, and he did it in this election I'm thinking of. Some things were dragged up from his past in the midst of a Republican primary, and one of the things that was brought up, and this is interesting for your viewers and listeners, he was one of the early adopters of posting on sports boards,
like fan comment
online,
boards,
comment boards, that kind of stuff.
Steelers
so
suck.
That
I
kind of stuff.
Bulls.
Why can't the Cowboys do better? Stuff like that. But of course, people veer into a lot of other topics on those message boards. And some of the things that he had talked about on those message boards, included saying that rape does not exist in marriage, and that that somebody could, quote, take what you want, my friend, is what he told somebody on a message board. He talked about wife swapping. He was promoting the physique of his wife to other men because he was engaged in talking about that. He talked about, and this is interesting politics in the GOP. He talked about trying to find somebody to smoke marijuana with. He said he wanted somebody to smoke the green with, and he was asking for advice on how to set up a marijuana growing operation in his home. And this came out, it was similar.
Sounds like he should run for Congress.
Salacious stuff from the guy's past, right? I mean, he was a very, very young man when he said these things online. And I think people sort of viewed that in his district. They viewed it the same way that Cisneros's, supporters would view the things being said about her now. And they rallied around him. And I think they're rallying around her because she's being attacked this way. And in fact, what I was told is at the time when this Republican lawmaker was under fire for all of this, he went and got rebaptized at his church on Sunday, and they all sort of laid hands on him because he's, and all of his public statements about it. This is what works on the Republican side. He would say, "I'm a sinner, and I've been saved by the grace of God," and that works in the GOP sense. And look, we've gotten to a point in this country's politics, right, where whenever your person is under fire, as long as this is true with Trump, especially with Trump, and on down, if your person's attacked for whatever, you just rally around them, right? And there's really not a lot of persuasion that's going on with any of that stuff,
right?
So who specifically are the demographics we should be watching who are on the fence? I mean, not decided right now, could be swayed in either direction.
It's interesting. I mean, and I'm not sure who wouldn't have their mind made up in this election at this point, right? I mean, these two candidates have been going at it all year. In a lot of ways, the runoff is longer and more arduous than the first round of voting. Again, it's 11 weeks, of a runoff. All the arguments have been made. As I like to say, the cake is baked. Wherever we're at now, this is it. We'll see what what comes out of the oven on Tuesday. But as far as demographics, I mean, she's got the younger folks. She's got the what conservatives would criticize as the leftist woke folks. And I think for Cuellar, he's got a lot of Hispanic men who are gun toting. They would have a gun rack on the back of their pickup truck and work in the oil and gas patch. And they want to see the kind of leadership that would represent them.
You sound, though, it sounds like, just reading between the lines that I hear from you, that you're sort of saying, look, for Cuellar, this is a trap game. It is technically on his home field, but we're in overtime and the weather's bad, and you just got to favor the visiting team when those are the conditions.
I think that's fair in a lot of ways. This is I have seen it over and over again in Texas politics. The percentage, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but the percentage of incumbents who win in a runoff in this state, Republican or Democrat, is very low in the legislature and in Congress. It's something that is historical. In southern states like Texas, the 50% threshold for having to have a runoff, because in some other places, like with the Madison Cawthorn race, that threshold is lower, right? They were able to beat him with just a plurality. In Texas, it's 50%. That was put in place by Democrats decades ago, the Dixiecrats, who wanted to keep people who favored segregation in office. So the 50% threshold is there to prevent change. So once you get past that, once you have an incumbent who drops below the 50%, the conditions are ripe for change. And that's generally what happens almost every time.
Can I ask you one question that's going to have no bearing on this race, but I feel like it might be a thematic question in the future. So you can do the hacky thing where you say there's two types of people in the world, like there's glass half full and glass half empty, or like, to me, people who like cranking Modelo's and people who don't. But is this a race that's sort of segmenting these new demographics in America? Kind of like looking at their biographies, Henry Cuellar seems like he's from sort of a multi-generational Latino American family that's sort of like been here and assimilated, for lack of a better term, versus Jessica Cisneros seems like her biography is like a little more like very recent immigrant family. And I don't even know if I'm reading those bios right, but like, is there something of a question that'll be answered in this race about like how the preferences of those two demographics are going to play out in the future?
You definitely have a dynamic in this state, and I think the rest of the country too, that the emerging energy in the Democratic Party is away from men, specifically away from white men. I was looking, and of course that wouldn't apply in this race, but for example, I was looking at some internal Democratic polling a few weeks back in a different race, but it applies generally. It used to be in Texas that for Democrats here, if they're looking at two names on the ballot, just the generic man versus generic woman, and you've seen this kind of poll done before. It used to be that those numbers broke down about +5 or 6 for the woman. The Democrats would just, in general, all other things being equal, they would prefer the woman by 5 or 6 points. Now that number is +15.
Wow.
Okay. And so, and it goes up to +20 if it's a woman of color, which of course would apply to Jessica Cisneros. And so you have this real shift. And it's the embodiment is that there are a few, but there are almost no male Democrats in the Texas legislature anymore. There used to be lots. In fact, it used to be almost all of them. Now and that's of course when they were much more conservative and really what we would probably say were Republicans now. But for Democrats, they don't just, they're looking at a person's qualifications, of course, and they're looking at their policy stances, different issues, their policy prescriptions for different things. But in a lot of ways, they're mostly concerned with identity politics. And that's not to say Republicans don't do the same thing, just a different kind of identity politics for sure. But with Democrats in this state, they want folks to check different boxes. Are you a woman? Good. Are you a woman of color? Good. Are you, LGBTQ? Good. Then they want to see. It's not necessarily good or bad. I'm just saying that it's what they want to see. They want to see a multi-ethnic, multiracial, but not necessarily multi-generational coalition, because they do tend to support folks who are younger for office, and you're seeing that all over the place and up and down the ballot.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, I think that the analysis you've laid out sounds right, but looking at it through my gambling or betting lens, when I hear the stuff, it makes me very tempted to take the underdog position in a race like this. And I say that because we're seeing throughout the country just a crisis in polling, not necessarily because pollsters don't know what they're doing, but it's just very hard now to figure out what's going on in this kind of an environment, which I think means that often the narrative is being set by journalists and commentators, both at the national level and also the local level, who are relying on sources and storylines that are just a little bit easier to get. And so what maybe gives me some pause in a race like this is I wonder if maybe the kind of person or voter or activist who might ultimately turn up and vote for a Cuellar may be a little bit harder to poll, maybe more reluctant to talk to a reporter, whereas someone like Cisneros, she's young, she's coming from an activist mold. Obviously national progressives would be just inherently more interested in her. I wonder if there's a potential here that maybe just an older style of Texas politics is going to come through for Cuellar, even if the longer term trend that you've identified may be working against him.
It may be right. And I think I said at the beginning of this, I would still tend to handicap this for Congressman Cuellar for a few reasons. I mean, he's in a bad spot for sure. He's up against the wall, but you're right, especially with the voters who are more rural voters, and that district takes in a lot of that. The polling in, I'll give you an example from the 2018 race, where at one point it looked like Beto O'Rourke might beat Ted Cruz. I mean, that was and interesting. When the early votes were reported on election night, O'Rourke was leading Cruz at 7 p.m. Central Time, which Cruz's campaign was ready for, because the first early votes we see in Texas are from the major urban counties, which report first, and then the smaller counties tend to trickle in later as we get those numbers out of the more far-flung parts of the state. In that election, and I see Cuellar doing a version of this in his race, in the 2018 election, toward the end of it, you saw Senator Cruz really start campaigning in rural Texas. He was starting to ignore the big population centers like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, et cetera. And instead, he was campaigning in places like Lubbock, Texarkana, a bunch of other places that your listeners and viewers have never heard of. And he was doing that to try to shore up the rural vote, which statewide in Texas at that point, and the number is probably about the same now, as one consultant said it to me, you can always count on the savings account of Republicans in this state, which is the rural vote. And that savings account is about 1 million votes. And so the savings account for Cuellar in this race, where he's probably looking to make up the difference, a lot of it's going to be in those rural counties. I mean, he's pretty shored up in his part of the district, in that southern end of the district, but really getting messages to those rural voters who, like you said, they're not going to talk to pollsters and they don't want to talk to reporters or any of that. Those rural voters are the ones who are definitely going to be his backstop if he can pull this off.
Do you rate there being, I want to move to Ken Paxton and George P. for a minute, but I have to ask. So by we, I mean, I sort of incorrectly handicapped a similar race in Oregon last week. I thought that what's-her-face, McLeod Skinner, was like a fake kind of Twitter candidate, and she wound up beating a similar incumbent by a pretty healthy margin in a primary there, and also a fairly moderately Democratic district. So do you think that there's a chance that Cisneros could just run away with this the way that what's-her-face did in Oregon?
I think there's a chance of that. I think that's where the energy is in the Democratic Party. We should say that, Bernie Sanders is coming into campaign in the closing days for Cisneros here. The progressive, socialist rock star on the far left coming in to prop up Cisneros right at the end, and I think really get her supporters of people who might be younger and don't understand what they need to do in a runoff. Here's the thing about younger voters. that I've discovered. I discovered this by sometimes the best stories are right there in your own house. By talking to my daughter, she voted in her first election back in 2020, and she voted in the primary. And once the primary was over, she didn't realize she needed to vote again in the general election, right? I talked to her about voting in November, and she said, I already voted for, the candidate I like. And I'm like, no, that was back in March. I had to explain, the whole bracket of how all that works. A lot of younger voters just don't know these basic things.
Right.
And so some of the folks who may have supported Cisneros the first, not even know that they need to go vote again. Here's a good example.
I mean, a candidate like her probably takes in a lot of first-time ever voters too.
Right. So they don't know they just don't know what they need to do. But there are a lot of voters, and that's not a criticism of them. There are a lot of voters who have been voting a long time who don't fully understand, the schedule of all this and how it all works. I'll give you an example. In 2014, there was a state senator who represented part of Dallas County and into East Texas, Greenville, Texas. His name is Bob Duell. Dr. Duell was thought of when he first was elected to the legislature years ago. He was thought of as sort of a right-wing flamethrower, very conservative. He was beat by a Tea Party guy in a runoff on the Republican side in 2014. And after he lost the runoff, people around town in Little Greenville, Texas, they would come up to him at lunch or at dinner or wherever. They'd see him in public at a grocery store or something. And they'd say, hey, Dr. Duell, what are you working on for next legislative session? And he would say, wait, don't you know that I lost? And they said, whoa, when was the election? So the big challenge with and this is the kind of thing that we probably should say first instead of here at the end of this discussion about this. The big challenge for someone in a runoff, because it's 11 weeks, is just to do the due diligence of block walking, holding campaign events, sending out those text messages and emails and however else you communicate with voters, just telling them when the election is and to vote for me, right? That is the basic thing they have to do. And I think a lot of these progressive organizers know that they need to do that. I think they know that. And Congressman Cuellar certainly knows that he needs to do that. And I think he's doing that in a way that he's never had to do before.
Let me ask one final question before we move on to George P. So in the scenario, let's say, where progressives really come out, Cisneros ends up winning and doing so by a comfortable margin, do you think that would carry over to the lieutenant governor race with an upset by Beckley, or is that one just a little bit stretched too far?
That's an interesting race. You have Mike Collier, who has run for a couple of offices in Texas, first for comptroller and now for lieutenant governor. He's been running for several cycles, for about 8 years now. And in Texas, because it's such a big place, that's one of the things that I had told more than a decade ago. I had told Democrats, y'all ought to be willing to put somebody on the ballot more than once, because in the first election, they may not even, voters may not even absorb who the person is, especially when you don't have resources. Look, Mike Collier, that race, Mike Collier versus Michelle Beckley, who's a state representative from Carrollton, Texas, up in DFW. She's not nearly as well known among the grassroots of the Democratic Party, only because Collier has kind of, for the last 8 years, been treating Texas like Iowa and traveling to every single little town and knowing everyone in the Democratic Party down to the precinct chair level. When President Biden was campaigning in Texas for the Democratic nomination, as they were all battling it out, Collier was on the Biden Texas team, trying to advise them on who they needed to talk to here, and was successful in helping to help the president on his way to the nomination. Of course, with the big states on Super Tuesday, like we are, it's not like Iowa and New Hampshire where they spend a lot of time there. It's more like they spend a few days here and just kind of move on. But Collier, because he has put so much time and effort into running statewide, if he's defeated on Tuesday, then that will mean that what we were talking about earlier with Democrats defaulting to the woman just because it's the woman, that really is the most important thing to those primary voters who participate in a runoff. And I'm being very specific about that because it's not the Democratic voter who necessarily is going to vote in, it's not representative of the one who's going to vote in November. And it may not even really be representative of the ones who voted in March. The kind of person who votes in a runoff in the Democratic or Republican Party, it's the most dedicated kind of activist within the party.
Like they probably need to be medicated to get out and vote in May.
the thing that I was told by a former Harris County Republican Party chairman was that their voters in places like suburban Harris County, which Harris County is huge. It's the biggest, it's the third largest county in the United States by population. That's where Houston is. And in the suburban areas, the Republican chairman told me that's our fortress precincts. That's where our voters, they drive around on random Saturdays just looking for vote here signs to make sure they didn't miss one.
Not anymore in Texas these days. Times are changing. Well, let's quickly, we'll give a couple minutes to George P. Bush versus Ken Paxton, which is easily the most interesting attorney general primary, or maybe just general election this year. So I will just say, maybe I'll say this quickly. So if you haven't been following this one, you're missing some great theater. George P. Bush is, of course, of the Bush family dynasty, two presidents from the state of Texas. Ken Paxton is the much maligned, constantly in legal trouble. I don't even know how many indictments he has hanging over him, but he's the current attorney general. And is he part of like the Bill Paxton? That's another big Texas dynasty, like the movie star from Aliens and Twister. Is he part of that dynasty?
No, he's not. Okay.
All right. Not a dynasty candidate, but
no.
Anyway, betting markets think this one's over and Paxton has it in the bag at, like 95% odds, but do you want to throw any water on that?
No, I mean, they're probably right. I mean, my guess is, and I don't make predictions in races. I just try to help people understand the battlefield. But I would not be shocked if Paxton defeated Bush, by as much as 70-30. It could be something like that. It could even be a little worse than that. And even some people who used to work for Commissioner Bush have agreed with that and said that I might be optimistic about Bush's chances when I say it. He has just been flailing. Bush has, and Commissioner Bush, I think, has missed so many opportunities to really step up and sort of burnish the Bush dynasty rather than be sort of the end of it. If you think about where the Bush dynasty started with his grandfather, George H.W. Bush in Houston, his very first job in politics really was being the GOP county chairman in Houston. And if you think about where he's from in Houston, the west side of the city is often talked about as the cradle of the establishment Republican Party in the United States. It's the kind of Republicans who are pro-business for sure, pro-immigration, pro-trade, that sort of stuff. They're for low taxes and a predictable regulatory environment and all that. But they'd be the same people who would attend a fundraiser for Planned Parenthood. And there are still some like that in that area. And some of those same Republicans would be the ones who helped Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher win her seat, right? That they were sort of offended by the person she beat, which is the former Congressman John Culberson, who I know you're familiar with. And so that has all shifted a lot. I was told that Commissioner Bush met with former President Trump twice. And the first meeting that they had was simply to ask for the endorsement in the race. And that, of course, didn't happen. Trump endorsed Paxton. And then the second meeting that I was told about between Bush and Trump was to ask this question, because I was told that Jeb, ! Jeb wanted to Jeb wanted to know the degree to which Trump was really going to get involved in the race. Is he just endorsing Paxton and that's it? Or was he going to come to Texas and rally for Paxton, cut TV commercials for him and all that sort of stuff, be active on social media, back when he was able to do that and all of that. And when Bush met with Trump to ask that question, and Bush, apparently said something like, look, I know that you're endorsing Ken Paxton. I respect that and everything. But we just have this question, because we want to know exactly how we should run our campaign. And I'm told that Trump didn't really answer that question. But what he said was, look, I don't have any problem with you. I like you. But Ken Paxton is the only attorney general in the whole country who would file that lawsuit for me to try to overturn the election results in some other states. And so I'm with Ken 100%. Instead of trying to be some kind of other candidate, and you guys have been, covering these other races in other states, instead of trying to be an anti-Trump candidate or something other than Trump candidate, which I think the second of those would be smarter, right? We've seen anti-Trump candidates just go down in flames in most places, but to try to be something different, instead of doing that, Bush instead just tried to lean into also being Trumpy, like has happened in these other races, like the J.D. Vance race in Ohio, where you have all these people who are trying to be the most Trumpy candidate, and only one of them has the actual endorsement. And sometimes that goes one way, sometimes it goes another way. But instead of trying to be a real alternative, Bush just leaned into trying to be the Trump candidate as well. So the big example on that was at the campaign kickoff right here in Austin for George P. Bush for Attorney General. He was handing out koozies. I wish I had one here, I'd show you, but he was handing out beer koozies that on one side said, George P. Bush for Texas Attorney General with the Texas flag, standard stuff. And on the other side, it had an image of George P. Bush with President Trump shaking hands somewhere at an event, I think an event in Houston. And under the image, it had a quote from Trump that said, "This is the Bush that got it right. This is the Bush that likes me. I like him." Donald Trump.
Do you think Republicans are going to start building like churches with stained glass windows of Donald Trump on them? Like, what? Trump, that is just weird.
I tweeted out the image of that koozie, and I do think, and I've got a decent little following on Twitter, I do think that it was remarkable for a few reasons. Number one, I think it's the most viewed thing I've ever put out on social media. So it's something like 6 million views or something for this koozie. And I had all these national media outlets, reaching out to me to ask this question: is that real? Because what he was doing with this campaign merchandise is throwing the whole Bush dynasty under the bus. There have been some Republicans that have been critical of Ken Paxton for saying that conservatives need to band together to end the Bush dynasty. That's in some of Paxton's campaign messages. Some Republicans have said, no, this should be about issues, it should be about our resumes and all of that for the candidates. But those people should remember, it was George P. Bush who first trashed the Bush dynasty by making that one of his key campaign messages, is that all the other Bushes are wrong about Trump, and I'm the one that's right.
Well, it sounds like
meantime, he's just been trashed by the Trump base for months.
It sounds like Ken Paxton had it right, though. So Paxton's running ads right now that says that that basically George P. Bush is woke and he won't stop school districts from teaching critical race theory, and that he's woke. And like, what is more woke than like hating your ancestors and, turning your back on, former presidents? Like it sounds like George P. Bush just super woke and should run as progressive, maybe.
With P, I mean, he squandered so many chances to do really good things. He's in the office he's in now. Is land commissioner. He heads up the general land office of Texas, and he likes to joke at campaign events that a lot of his job is explaining to voters what the land office even does. Some critics have said if he would put as much energy into actually doing the job, then people wouldn't have to have it explained to them. The land office, the land office is very important. They do a few things that are key in this state. For example, they help administer relief funds for disasters like Hurricane Harvey, which was back in 2017. There are still a lot of people who are upset years later about the way all that unfolded. I've covered a lot of natural disasters in Texas because we get all of them. There's always something trying to kill you in Texas, whether it's a hurricane or a rattlesnake or a wildfire or whatever. 110-degree temperatures. If you
driver on the Katy Parkway.
Yes, people trying to merge onto the freeway, right? Yeah. All of that. And the person trying to drive is either going to kill you by running into you or shooting you on the freeway, right? So it's the Wild West in a lot of ways. So y'all come, and check out Texas. But look, the political fallout from a disaster like Hurricane Harvey, it doesn't just happen in the days and weeks after the disaster. It happens in the months and years after the disaster, when people don't feel like they have been made whole and that the government hasn't done enough to help them. One of the things the land office was charged with is helping to administer, the rebuilding of homes along the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Harvey. And I did the math on this. It's something like 1/5 of the electorate in a GOP primary lives in the counties that were directly impacted by Hurricane Harvey. So that's strike one against Commissioner Bush. The other thing that he has really bungled in the estimation of conservatives is something that's sort of sacred. You mentioned stained glass.
Yeah,
we have sort of a shrine to Texas and to our independence that he's in charge of. You might have heard of it. It's called the Alamo. The land office oversees it in San Antonio. And the way that historic site is governed is a real mess. It's a disaster because the land office is involved, so state government, as well as the city government of San Antonio, where it is. And there's also a nonprofit that's involved in the governance of how everything is handled there. And Commissioner Bush put forward a plan to, quote unquote, reimagine the Alamo, which of course Ken Paxton turned into basically a CRT thing, or it's a liberal woke plan to change it. And actually, if you look at what Commissioner Bush was planning there, what he wanted to do is actually a pretty reasonable idea to kind of give people more of a sense of exactly what all happened at the Alamo, at the Battle of the Alamo, and all of the things surrounding the timeline of the one day. That's around here, a lot of folks like to just focus on the one day when there was the big battle at the Alamo, the siege at the Alamo, but there's a lot more to the history, and a lot of folks just don't want to hear about that. And there was a book out this past year that's pretty controversial called Forget the Alamo, written by some friends of mine, Chris Tomlinson over at the Houston Chronicle, and Jason Stanford, who's a Democrat here in Austin. But that's something that the conservative grassroots was very upset about. You remember all these arguments about preserving our monuments, quote unquote, around the country as some of these statues were coming down.
War statues and
years ago, I went to a few campaign events with the former land commissioner, Jerry Patterson, who's sort of thought of as the godfather of the modern gun rights movement in Texas because he authored the concealed carry law originally when he was a state senator. And this was at the time that Patterson was challenging George P. Bush for the land office. And the former commissioner had his whole spiel for the crowd at these GOP events about what the land commissioner does. And Patterson had actually supported George P. Bush when he first ran for that office, and then later said he had misgivings because of how bad a job he was doing. That's the way he put it. Well, after Patterson would speak and he'd open it up for questions with these GOP voters, the first thing they would ask about was the Alamo and, quote, preserving our monuments. So there's strike two against George P. Bush as far as the GOP electorate in the state who have just not been impressed with him. And I do think that in a general election, the Bush name is probably still a net positive in Texas, but in a primary, it's been trashed now by former President Trump and others. And now Paxton is, just latching onto that by saying it's time to end the Bush dynasty, which I do think is going to happen on Tuesday.
Well, I don't buy a lot of 97-cent yes shares, but Pratik, do you think there's anything more we can squeeze out of Scott while we've got him?
Yeah, I did. Just given a lot of the themes you mentioned on the Democratic side, I did want to give you an opportunity if you have thoughts. Anything about Texas 15? This is another case. Ruben Ramirez, the markets regard him as an underdog, the military veteran against Michelle, I guess it's Vallejo, more of the progressive mold. The markets are saying she is a 70-30 favorite. Do you have any thoughts about that one?
I would say generally, and I haven't followed that one as closely. By the way, Texas is one of those places where it's impossible to know all your congressmen. When Beto O'Rourke, because we have, almost 40 congressmen, when Beto O'Rourke was first running statewide in Texas, most people had never heard of him because he was from El Paso, kind of came out of nowhere. I do think, though, that the way those lines have been drawn in South Texas for some of these districts, and remember, Republicans were redrawing the lines without the old constraints of the Voting Rights Act that were gutted by the Supreme Court over the last decade. They drew those districts specifically for this sort of divide and conquer strategy, right? That perhaps they would see, and to your question about whether there might be some super PAC money or whatever coming in to try to support some of these more progressive candidates so that Republicans have a better shot at it. In a lot of ways, they accomplished much of that through the redistricting process by drawing districts that might very well nominate somebody who is more in the progressive mold, such that it puts it a little more in play for Republicans come November, which people will call cynical, other people will say it's just smart politics.
Interesting. Well, I feel like we've just taken a bath in I'm trying to figure out how to not use a Texas cliche in Lone Star State Apocrypha, but this is the stuff that really I think matters on the margin. Everyone can read a poll, but very few people can know what that actually means day to day on the ground and in the minds of the people who show up and vote and run for office. So, Scott, where can people find you? I'll let you say it in your own words. Your Quorum Report. What's your podcast called again? And you're on Twitter too, right?
I'm on Twitter, unfortunately. Yeah, I guess you have to be there if you're doing political stuff or political journalism. It's one of the occupational hazards is you have to be on Twitter at Scott Braddock. It's just my name. People can also check us out, our coverage at quorumreport.com and the Texas Take podcast with the Houston Chronicle. You can find the Texas Take on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, however you get your podcasts, wherever you consume this amazing podcast. I'm sure you can find our podcast as well. Just search for Texas Take.
All right. Well, Scott, thank you for joining. Hopefully you'll be keen to hop on again sometime in the future. This has been fun for us. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Talk soon.